Teddy Roosevelt is one of those presidents that can be hard for modern political observers to understand. He was a Republican at the same time he was a progressive. Yes, this shows how ideology and partisanship are not necessarily synonymous terms. But still, in 1912, former President Roosevelt ditched the Republican Party to become the presidential candidate for the Progressive Party, which was nicknamed the Bull Moose Party. Eventually, he would find his way back to the Republican Party during the 1916 election. In this video, we're going to talk about Teddy Roosevelt's journey to, time in, and departure from the Progressive Party. Hello, my name is Dave, and welcome to Election History. I do videos about campaigns, elections, candidates, political parties, and the likes. If you like these types of videos, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. If you would like to help out even more, you can become a Patreon member with the link in the description below. Here are my current Patreon members, and I would like to thank all of them for their support. Also, this is my first venture into politics from over 100 years ago. I usually make videos on modern politics, but let me know in the comment section below if you would like to see more older elections from the 1800s and early 1900s. Also, in the description, I list some of the resources that I use, which also go into great detail about Roosevelt's life. But I will admit his time in the Progressive Party isn't as well documented as one might think. And with that, let's get on with the video. The story of former President Theodore Roosevelt going from the Republican Party to the Progressive Party is a great political science lesson. It shows that partisanship and ideology aren't synonymous. Many in today's political world want to conflate the two in order to create disinformation. But in the early 1900s, both sides had their wings. Both the Republicans and the Democrats had progressives and conservatives. Both parties also had big businesses backing them up. So I guess in that sense, nothing has really changed in the last 120 years on that front. Still, Roosevelt would have been considered someone of the progressive wing of the Republican Party. In 1908, Roosevelt decided that he wasn't going to run for another term as president. Even though he had only been elected to one term, he served nearly all of President William McKinley's term after McKinley was assassinated in Buffalo, New York. Therefore, he pledged not to run for a third term as president. But as president, Roosevelt could be considered moderate and not wanting to upset the apple cart when it came to domestic affairs. Yes, when it came to foreign affairs, he was purely an imperialist and believed in expanding American influence abroad. But domestically, he wanted to strike a balance between conservatives and progressives. When it came to racial issues, Roosevelt played both sides, supporting civil rights for blacks, but also not wanting to upset Southerners who could be allies for his progressive agenda, especially against those in his own party. As for non-racial issues, Roosevelt was a progressive. His administration broke up monopolies, filing 43 antitrust suits against major corporations, including Standard Oil, as well as suing other massive railroad trusts, such as those owned by J.P. Morgan and James J. Hill. However, he wasn't anti-business, but anti-monopoly. He felt that businesses could do good, but that the government should be a regulatory body to protect the consumer. One of those acts was the establishment of the Food and Drug Administration. He also supported conservation and environmental policies, such as the creation of national parks, forests, and monuments, as well as the United States Forest Service. In regards to labor, he also took a different approach, supporting negotiations with unions to broker deals instead of trying to bust the unions. This was apparent during the coal strike of 1902 when 140,000 coal miners went on strike, with the Roosevelt administration becoming a neutral mediator between the miners and the mining companies, which led to shorter hours and increased wages. Now, before we continue, you might have noticed that I have said conservative and progressive, but not liberal. The term liberal at that time was still connected to classical liberalism, which we associate nowadays with libertarianism. It wouldn't be until Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal era when the term liberal became synonymous with public safety net programs. So throughout this video, we will be using progressive to talk about those on the left of the political spectrum. There's also a second thing that I want to mention here, and that is the Socialist Party, as well as other socialist movements like the Wobblies. Some might see Roosevelt as being a supporter of the socialists because of his pro-labor positions. But remember, Roosevelt believed that business was still beneficial, whereas the socialists did not support the idea of capitalism and wanted the workers to take over the means of production in pure Marxist fashion. Right now, I'm reading a book called Reds, The Tragedy of American Communism by Maurice Eiserman, and I highly recommend it if you want to understand the early history of the Socialist Party and Communist Party in the United States. After Roosevelt decided not to run in 1908, he wanted to support a successor that would continue his policies. As mentioned before, there were two rival factions within the Republican Party, the conservatives and progressives, of which Roosevelt was part of the progressives. One person that he saw that fit the bill was Secretary of War William Howard Taft, as he had been a vocal supporter of the president. Because Taft was Roosevelt's choice and Roosevelt was a popular president, the Republican establishment did not oppose Taft being selected as the presidential nominee for the Republicans. But with conservatives outnumbering progressives in the party, they wanted to make sure that their interests were met as well. Therefore, the delegates at the convention picked conservative Republican James S. Sherman as the vice presidential candidate, winning convincingly on the first ballot. Taft would go on to win the general election against William Jennings Bryan with a reduced margin compared to Roosevelt 4 years earlier, but still convincing. Roosevelt himself was involved with the campaign, but not highly involved, as he was already thinking about life outside of the White House. Once Roosevelt moved out of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, he wanted to leave the political world behind. He nearly set off immediately after his presidency to go on an expedition of Africa, sponsored by the Smithsonian Institute and funded by Andrew Carnegie. So, yeah, while Roosevelt didn't like big moneyed interest, he didn't have any problem using those same people to fund his pet projects. Still, while he was in Africa, he wanted to be as far away from contact from the United States as possible and tried to make it nearly impossible for anyone back home to get in contact with him. But by May of 1910, Roosevelt was looking forward to coming back home. During his time in Africa and immediately after his return to the United States, a number of progressive Republicans complained to Roosevelt about the Taft administration. They argued that it had not been progressive and that Taft had become influenced by conservatives within the party. While this did seem to upset Roosevelt, H.W. Brand's biography on Roosevelt argues that Roosevelt being upset at Taft came more from personal grievances and perhaps jealousy more than it did policy. When Taft won the election, he gave his brother as much credit for the victory as Roosevelt, with Roosevelt later saying that it was Roosevelt himself that gave Taft the victory. When Taft made appointments and policy decisions, Roosevelt reacted in a "I wouldn't have done it that way" manner. Essentially, Roosevelt saw Taft as his protege and criticized every little decision that Taft made. While Roosevelt did give Taft space to conduct his own affairs as president, there was almost a vibe like a father being mad at his son because he didn't get into the family business. But Taft did abandon many of Roosevelt's ideas and supported the conservatives, with Taft supporting the anti union, pro business interests in the House and Senate. This led to his presidency being unpopular with the 1910 midterm elections approaching. With a Democratic landslide on the horizon, Taft wanted Roosevelt to help the Republicans so that he could repair his image with progressive Republicans. For Roosevelt, he knew this wasn't going to be easy. If he abandoned the Republican Party, he might be shut out of Republican Party politics. If he did help Taft, then progressives might alienate him. In the end, Roosevelt decided to simply say that the Taft presidency was better than the Democratic alternative, thus not endorsing the policies of Taft's presidency. The midterm election resulted in a landslide victory for the Democrats, taking control of the House of Representatives and gaining 9 seats in the U.S. Senate, though the Republicans still held 50 seats after the election, controlling the chamber by 8 seats. Many conservatives in the Republican Party blamed Roosevelt for the midterm losses, with some even advocating for him to be removed from the party. After the midterm election, Roosevelt saw himself as the person that could possibly bring change to the Republican Party. He argued that the party's loss in the midterm election was because it had lost its progressive roots. Not only did he say that the Republican Party needed to be the party of labor, but that it also needed to push forward with more antitrust legislation and to remove money from politics. He even attended an event to commemorate abolitionist martyr John Brown, which was seen as radical in many conservative Republican circles. At this event, he continued to argue that there is no capital without labor and coined what was to be called New Nationalism. But Roosevelt wasn't a fan of what he would consider radical elements in the progressive Republican movement. When invited to join the National Progressive Republican League by Senator Robert La Follette, Roosevelt declined the invitation. And even though he was a progressive, he still considered himself a Republican. Even though he was pushed by other progressives in the Republican Party to run for president, Roosevelt declined, stating that the party was purely behind President Taft and that he should not run for the nomination. However, he did want to bring change to the Republican Party and bring light to progressive issues. It was just a matter of how to do that. 1 year before the 1912 election, Roosevelt was still insistent that he wasn't going to be a candidate for the Republican nomination for president. However, many in his own party insisted that he take on the increasingly unpopular incumbent Republican president. It even went so far that Ohio Republicans, which was Taft's home state, were starting draft Roosevelt movements, which included the son of former President James Garfield. While Roosevelt would go on to say that the support and these endorsements made him feel uncomfortable, it was now coming to the point that he wouldn't stop people from pushing the idea of him running. One example of this was that he was no longer shooting down the idea of a president serving a third term. This was basically the 1992 Ross Perot approach of running but not running at the same time. He would only be the Republican nominee if the party picked him. Early in the 1912 campaign, there were two major candidates running for the Republican nomination. Of course, one of those candidates was incumbent President William Howard Taft, who had the support of the conservatives. The other was Robert La Follette, who was the choice of progressives. When it came to this matchup, Roosevelt supported Taft as he saw La Follette as too much of a radical progressive. Still, other progressives, such as California Governor Hiram Johnson, lined up to support La Follette's campaign. But after it was apparent that La Follette's campaign lacked enthusiasm, Johnson and others jumped from La Follette and said that they would support Roosevelt if he decided to run. In February 1912, Roosevelt stated, quote, "I will accept the nomination for president if it is tendered to me. I will adhere to the decisions until the convention has expressed its preference." End of quote. While this wasn't necessarily an official entry into the race, it was the message that was needed to his supporters that they can go ahead and try to get him the Republican nomination. But there was one problem, and that was the dying support for progressivism within the Republican Party. The Republican Party apparatus was becoming more conservative, with the business interest in control of many within state politics. But one of the ways that Roosevelt could fight against the moneyed interest, which was a key component of his campaign, was to perform well in the Republican primaries. The 1912 Republican primaries were the first ever primaries held. While not held in all states, they were held in important states such as Illinois, Pennsylvania, Ohio, California, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Roosevelt's home state of New York. While Taft won some of the first Republican Party conventions, the first primary state was in Roosevelt's home state of New York. Roosevelt didn't campaign hard, assuming that he was going to win his home state quite handily. However, Taft ended up being the winner, taking 59 of New York's 90 pledged delegates. The next primary state was in Wisconsin, where La Follette won easily. It was at this point where Roosevelt knew that he needed to campaign harder. This realization led to a grueling 2-month campaign schedule that would see him travel from coast to coast. Roosevelt would win the Illinois, Pennsylvania, Nebraska, Oregon, California, Ohio, New Jersey, and South Dakota primaries, while splitting the delegates with Taft in the Massachusetts and Maryland primaries. In the end, Roosevelt would win 51.5% of all votes cast in the primary, as well as 281 pledged delegates. But at the Republican convention, the non pledged delegates, again controlled by the business interest, were solidly behind Taft, which led to his eventual nomination for a second term. The Roosevelt campaign accused the Taft campaign of stealing the nomination and abstained from the presidential nomination vote. The same delegates then left the Republican convention, went over to the Chicago Orchestra Hall, and nominated Roosevelt as the presidential candidate for what they would eventually call the Progressive Party, with Hiram Johnson being his vice presidential running mate. Now, one could argue that the Progressive Party, nicknamed the Bull Moose Party, was simply a rejection of the conservatism of the Republican Party under Taft. But it wasn't, as they truly had progressive views. I've linked the party's platform in the description below, but here are some of the ideas it proposed: women's suffrage, a nationwide primary election, the direct election of senators, a federal minimum wage, an 8-hour workday, national social insurance, as well as a national health insurance, an inheritance tax, opposition to tariffs, campaign contribution limits, and limiting lobbyists by making them register with the federal government, continued conservation projects, though they did support opening up Alaska for mining. I mean, the list goes on and sounds more like something that Bernie Sanders and AOC would come up with today. But the one thing that was missing from their platform was any ideas of American imperialism that Roosevelt supported in the past. Yes, the platform did say that the Panama Canal should be the property of the United States, but it should also be used to foster good relations with Latin American countries. One of the progressives who wasn't on board was Robert La Follette. One could say that he might have been jealous of Roosevelt being picked instead of him for the Progressive Party nomination. But remember, it was Roosevelt's delegates from the Republican convention that started the party, not La Follette's. In the end, La Follette would not endorse any candidate and stayed quiet throughout the campaign. In the 1912 general election, you had three major candidates with different visions of the United States. Democratic nominee Woodrow Wilson supported the idea of the New Freedom, which focused on individual freedoms leading the path to economic prosperity. Essentially, it was considered the most libertarian campaign in rhetoric, but did support progressive ideas like the 8-hour workday and tariff reform. As for Roosevelt's campaign, the focus was more on governmental involvement in providing services and protections from corporations. As for Taft, he mostly ran on keeping high tariffs, which would protect the American economy from foreign competition. But this policy was failing miserably. Maybe someone could take a history lesson, but that would actually involve reading. But still, during the campaign, Roosevelt stuck with his progressive views, not deviating from them at all. But on October 14th, his campaign would grind to a halt as John Schrank, who believed that the ghost of William McKinley told him to kill Roosevelt, shot Roosevelt in Milwaukee. Still, Roosevelt, being shot, delivered his speech saying, quote, "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether you fully understand that I have been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." End of quote. He would continue to speak for 90 minutes before seeking treatment. He would stay off the campaign trail until October 30th, just days before the election. On Election Day, which was November 5th, Woodrow Wilson would go on to win the election, winning 435 electoral votes to Roosevelt's 88 and Taft's 8. Even though it was an electoral landslide, Wilson would only win the majority of the vote in states that made up the former Confederacy. Wilson won 14 states with less than 40% of the vote, which included winning Idaho with less than a third at 32.1%. But the progressives did pick up 8 seats in the House of Representatives, but added 2 more members who ran under a different ticket later on. But what happened to Roosevelt after the election? Well, as in the past, he went off on another expedition, this time to Latin America. During his time in Latin America, he fell ill with a high fever, which led him to losing 50 pounds. When he returned to the United States, he was asked if he would lead the Progressive Party in the midterm elections. With his health not as good as before, he couldn't make the commitment to campaign like he had in 1912. But his concerns went beyond that. Roosevelt started to muse as to whether the Progressive Party can be an electoral success. Yes, he would campaign for the party and still supported the party's platform, but he wondered if the party itself would be the best way to bring about progressive reforms. Instead of talking about how the Progressive Party could move forward, he instead spoke about how progressives should work to increase their influence in the Democratic and Republican parties. Essentially, he was cooling on the Progressive Party as a political entity. This was a problem for many in the Progressive Party. Unlike Roosevelt, who was no longer in politics, other Republicans turned progressives were still in politics. They burned their bridges with the Republican Party by supporting Roosevelt in 1912, and going back to the party was near impossible. Even if they tried to go back to the Republican Party, they might not be accepted. The 1914 midterm elections brought a mixed bag, with the Progressive Party losing 4 seats in Congress, but also re electing Hiram Johnson as the governor of California under their ticket, with the Republicans kicking him out of the party. But still, this election showed that the party was going to be nothing but a minor player in national politics. Going into 1916, progressives wondered if Roosevelt would be the nominee for the party. While Roosevelt still supported the platform of the party, practicality would be Roosevelt's guiding light. Roosevelt was not a fan of President Woodrow Wilson on a number of different issues. And while he wasn't a friend of the Republican presidential nominee Charles Hughes, he was more of a moderate Republican that Roosevelt could live with. Still, the Progressive Party would go ahead and nominate Roosevelt as their presidential candidate. But soon afterward, Roosevelt would send a telegram to the convention telling him that he would not accept the nomination and would be supporting the Republican candidate. Wilson would win the 1916 election, but the result would be close. Had Hughes won 3,774 votes more in California, he would have been elected President of the United States. When it came to the 1918 midterm elections, Roosevelt continued to show his progressive streak, but maybe becoming a little bit more moderate. One of the reasons for this was that some of the Progressive Party's ideas actually did become law. Still, he continued to advocate for public housing, universal health care, and other progressive social programs. Still, when it came to his involvement in 1918, he was strongly opposed to Woodrow Wilson's plan for peace after World War I, attacking Wilson's 14 points. His dislike for the Democrats, and particularly Wilson, was his driving force to help the Republicans win. The Progressive Party was still around, but was a shell of its former self. The party would eventually dissolve in 1920. Theodore Roosevelt would pass away on January 6, 1919. So, back to the theme of this video. Was Roosevelt a progressive? Absolutely. The issues that he supported would be aligned with today's progressive movement. And while he didn't agree with the socialists in regards to workers taking over the means of production, they did have a number of shared views. In fact, it could easily be said that Roosevelt was a social democrat, like what we see with the social democrats in Germany today. However, he was a Republican as well. From his time serving in the New York State Assembly in 1883 until he passed away in 1919, Roosevelt was a partisan Republican and disliked the Democrats. If the Progressive Party had been successful, he might have stayed on with them in 1916. But it does seem like the Bull Moose movement was nothing more than a vehicle of Roosevelt's presidential ambition. It seems highly unlikely that Roosevelt saw that movement becoming nothing more than a one-off party. This also brings me to another thing that I mentioned earlier in the video, and that is that partisanship and ideology are not the same. Yes, there are those who want to conflate the two because it fits perfectly into their narrative by tying the current Democratic Party to slavery, but not tying conservatism to slavery. But at the end of the day, partisan affiliation is nothing more than a label. It doesn't have any ideology, though people of certain ideologies do drift to like-minded people in political organizations. Political parties are just purely political organizations and nothing more. And with that, we are finished with today's video. If you liked the video, please press the thumbs up button down below. And remember, you can support the channel on Patreon with the link down in the description. Have a wonderful day wherever it is you are, and I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.